One of the deepest needs of the human heart is the need to be valued. Every human being craves to be accepted for what they are. When I am not accepted, then something in me is broken. A student who does not feel accepted by their teacher will not learn. A life without acceptance is a life in which a most basic human need goes unfulfilled. Acceptance means that the people with whom I live give me a feeling of self-respect, a feeling that I am worthwhile. They are happy that I am who I am. Acceptance means I am welcome to be myself. Acceptance means that though there is a need for growth, I am not forced. I do not have to be the person I am not. Each one of us is born with many potentials, but unless they are drawn out by the warm touch of another's acceptance, they will remain dormant. Acceptance liberates everything that is in me. Only when I am loved in that deep sense of complete acceptance can I become myself. The love, the acceptance of others and myself makes me the unique person that I am meant to be. I am accepted by God as I am, not as I should be. God knows me by my name. See, I have branded you on the palms of my hands. St. Augustine said, "A friend is someone who knows everything about you and still accepts you." God is the fulfillment of this dream. But it's one thing to know God loves you. It's another to realize it. That was an excerpt from a book that is no longer in print, As Bread That Is Broken by Peter G. von Bremen, a Jesuit priest. I first discovered this book on an 8-day silent retreat I participated in during the final week of my college career. Even though it was written in 1974, von Bremen really captures the universal struggle for acceptance. In 1943, psychologist Abraham Maslow developed a hierarchical theory of needs that one needs to fulfill in order to become a fully functioning person, or what he called the self-actualizing person. He explains that a person does not feel the higher need until the demands of the previous have been satisfied. The model looks like this. The physiological needs are on the bottom, followed by safety needs, needs of love, affection, and belongingness, the need for esteem, and finally self-actualization on top. Maslow states that acceptance is part of the third basic need. People seek to overcome feelings of loneliness and alienation, which involves both giving and receiving love and affection, and a sense of belonging. I recall once teaching this lesson and having a student actually break down in class when she realized that she had previously prevented somebody else's growth due to her own unacceptance of that person. Acceptance is a very real need. Heck, I still get haunted by memories and insecurities from grade school of being rejected by my peers for being different. I still, today, have a hard time acquainting with new people in fear that I'd be rejected. How many people do you think that are on their deathbeds actually still hold on to this childhood memory of feeling unaccepted? That's why I'll never understand how a parent could refuse to accept their own child due to their sexuality or gender identity. They are telling their own flesh and blood that the way they love and the way they receive love and who they are at their innermost core is broken and disordered. If a student can't learn when they feel unaccepted by their teachers, how badly does a kid get screwed up when not accepted by their own parent? And how could that child ever love again? As we've said throughout this course, there are staggering numbers of depression, substance abuse, and suicides in the LGBT community. Why? Unacceptance. unacceptance by parents or other family members, unacceptance by society, unacceptance by church and therefore a feeling of unacceptance by God, unacceptance of self. The Bible teaches that God created humans to flourish. The glory of God gives life, says Irenaeus of Lyons. And that's one of the graces of marriage. When someone accepts you fully, you can fully be yourself. That naked imagery of Adam and Eve. When you're naked, you hide nothing. Acceptance is like a pinch of salt that brings out the natural flavor of that main dish. And sometimes all you need is just a pinch. This reminds me of Jesus' teachings on salt and light in the Gospel of Matthew. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Let your light shine to give glory to Father in heaven. Let that salt bring out the flavor. In my opinion, that's the power of acceptance. It can bring out your greatness or utterly destroy you. Philosopher Paul Tillich defined faith as the courage to accept acceptance. When God loves and accepts me, I must accept myself as well. I cannot be more demanding than God, can I? Von Bremen lists symptoms of unacceptance that includes boasting, rigidity, inferiority complex, superficial joy, a desire to assert yourself, gossiping, suspicion of others, exaggerating, and feeling threatened. I know a lot of snarky queers out there that fit that bill. So the human need for acceptance is the reason why coming out of the closet in the queer community is such a sacred rite of passage. It is a passage to one's fulfillment, to life. In a way, coming out is a lot like a Christian baptism. Both contain a form of dying and rising, leaving behind an old life to begin a new one. For queers, it's a life of heteronormativity, a life of alienation, to be born again into your true queer self. It's a transformation from the illegitimate and unacceptable, the profane, to the legitimate and acceptable, the sacred. It's a transition from feeling alone and uncomfortable in one's own skin to feeling self-confident in a community. In the early Christian church, when Christianity was still illegal, being baptized was potentially a death sentence. If word got out that you were a Christian, the state could arrest and sentence you to death, and they did. Well, unfortunately, there are still places today in this world where coming out as LGBT is also a sentence to die, punishable by the state or informally in a back alley. This is an especially grim reality in the transgender community that witnessed 27 murders in 2019 and 28 in the first 7 months of 2020, including 2 right here in Ohio. African American and Latina transgender women are particularly vulnerable. Because of the danger involved, coming out is an act of faith and must always occur on one's own terms. Nicodemus displays the process of coming out in the Gospel of John. In that Gospel, Nicodemus, a wealthy and prominent Pharisee, comes to Jesus at night, in secret, with a curiosity surrounding this man. That evening, Jesus teaches him the importance of being born again, a message that Nicodemus doesn't immediately comprehend. How can anyone be born after having grown old? Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born? Ew. What is interesting about the introduction of Nicodemus is that he goes to Jesus at night. And this passage ends with Jesus indicating that people who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. Jesus is talking about how Nicodemus needs to come out of the closet as a Christian. It is important to walk in the light, in truth. The closet can be a very dark place where one can passively sit idle their entire life. And the fact that Nicodemus only visits Jesus at night, not publicly, is a sign that he's afraid and thus not ready to be born again. But as John's gospel progresses, we see a character arc for Nicodemus, who goes from being that secret inquirer to publicly defending Jesus in front of a crowd in the middle of that gospel, to assisting Joseph of Arimathea in financing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial in the tomb at the end of that gospel. This teaches us that people must come out on their own terms and at their own time in order to finally live in that light. Even Jesus himself went through something similar. I want you to take a moment and watch this video reflection that I made a few years ago that compares the reveal of Jesus' messianic identity to the queer experience of coming out of the closet.
Is it a sin to remain in the closet? If you believe in the theology that says that God made all beings good, but you are ashamed of being LGBT, then yes, because you are ultimately rejecting God's design and calling for you. Hiding in the closet is no different than hiding your light under a bushel basket. But how about being in the closet out of fear of family, church, job, or societal backlash? Would that be a sin? I don't think so, and here's why. Jesus actually went through something very similar in Mark's gospel. One of the unique characteristics of that gospel's portrayal of Christ is what is known as the messianic secret. In short, Mark never explicitly states that Jesus is the Messiah, let alone God. As a matter of fact, whenever any of Jesus' followers infer his identity, he sternly tells them not to proclaim it. So in Mark's gospel at least, Jesus chooses to remain in the messianic closet. Now, why did he do this, you might be wondering? Well, there are a lot of variables, one major one having to do with attracting too much attention. Every LGBT person has had the experience of confiding their identity in close friends, asking that they say nothing to anyone out of worry of the attention it might bring. In Mark chapter 1, for instance, Jesus heals and tells a leper not to tell anyone. The leper fails to obey, and once word spreads about Jesus' miracle, he could no longer go into a town openly. It's not long before the religious leaders of his day begin to criticize him for breaking God's commandments and labeling him a blasphemer. In other words, whenever he publicly acted on his identity, he was called by religious people a sinner. Mark 6 provides a fascinating encounter that takes place in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. Here, where Jesus teaches at what was probably his old neighborhood synagogue, the crowd begins to question him and take offense that he was teaching them. Jesus, amazed at their unbelief, said, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And it says that he could do no deed of power there. Many LGBT people have had experiences of leaving their families and hometowns to find and live among more diverse and progressive environments, such as New York City. Many queer people make this pilgrimage in an effort to find acceptance for who they are. Jesus, as a prophet of God, was not accepted by his hometown. His neighbors and likely extended family members would have preferred that he remain that same old carpenter kid who grew up there. In short, Jesus was not free to be himself while at home. A bit further in his ministry, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, I can't think of any living soul who hasn't asked their friends that same question. What are people saying about me? What are they calling me? Especially when you're hiding something. When Peter acknowledges that Jesus is the Messiah, again, Jesus sternly orders him not to tell anyone about him. This is quickly followed up by Jesus preaching about what it means to be a Messiah and that he is ultimately going to suffer and die. In a humorous encounter, Peter impulsively tells Jesus that he's wrong. I remember one time when I told one of my best friends that I was gay, and his immediate response was, "I know you, Russ. You're not gay." Don't you think I know? Mark 9 tells of Jesus' transfiguration, a moment when Jesus encounters Moses and Elijah atop a mountain and glows dazzling white, a glimpse and foreshadowing of his divine self. A voice from heaven acknowledges his messianic identity once more, saying that Jesus is God's son and that we should listen to him. A few years ago, when I was still closeted, despite my efforts to conceal, there were moments when my true self was shown to others. This would normally take place at theater conferences, where I was among fellow LGBT people. My good friend, awed by my personality, would tell me afterwards how lively I appeared during those weekends, describing me as giddy and joyous. In retrospect, these were transfigured moments for me, when my true nature shined out from behind my closeted door. In a gospel where Jesus constantly hid who he really was due to society, church, and law, the transfiguration was a moment when his veil was lifted and his true nature shined, brighter than bleach, leaving his friends in awe. 2 chapters later, Jesus is described as triumphantly entering Jerusalem with people waving palm branches. Catholics to date still commemorate this event known as Palm Sunday, the beginning of Passion Week. It's not a coincidence that the same week when Jesus gets a parade in his honor, he ends up dead. The entry into Jerusalem with palms a-waving was characteristic of parades that were thrown to honor kings and militants returning from battle. The term Messiah comes from a Hebrew word that literally means anointed one, in reference to Jewish kingship. So here, Jesus is getting a king's parade, which would have been problematic for him considering it was a Roman-controlled land. I always try to imagine Jesus' reaction at that given moment. There he is, smiling, waving, thinking, "Oh God, I'm so gonna die." LGBT people have pride parades today that honor our history and our identity. Yet, I'll acknowledge there are times when I thought as Jesus likely had on Palm Sunday. For instance, will this parade be my last? Is somebody watching, waiting for me to be away from the crowds in order to come get me? Is this parade gonna lead to my death? This, of course, happened to Jesus. Within days of his parade, Jesus was arrested and put to death under Roman law for claims that he was trying to be a Jewish king in a Roman-controlled region. In short, he was put to death because he was outed. And the LGBT community knows this all too well. Our solace, of course, comes at the end of the gospel, at the resurrection account when it's proclaimed that Jesus is the Son of God and it's time to go out and tell the world. The original ending to Mark, however, ended with verse 8, "For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." In other words, the disciples closet themselves right at the exact moment when Jesus is gloriously liberated from his. The story of Jesus' closeted messianic identity is one that LGBT people can relate to. Like Jesus, having to remain in the closet isn't because we're not ready to come out, it's because society isn't ready. We have to be selective in who we confide in out of fear of public attention and rejection from our hometown, churches, and work. True, there are times where we allow ourselves to shine, perhaps in gay bars or clubs or places where we feel safe, where we have these transfigured moments when we get to dazzle. But still, there's many of us who fear persecution when we march in parades, show public displays of affection, or step foot into a town that isn't quite ready for us. Most fittingly, don't forget that it was also a same-sex kiss in public that revealed Jesus' identity to the soldiers that were looking to arrest him. Jesus' journey ultimately reminds us that although societal sin may warrant that we hide who we are at times, the gospel's final word isn't the cross, but the resurrection. And at that resurrection, we are simply divine.
We who are queer have worked out our own sexuality and gender. We were able to listen to the internal voice that spoke to us about who we are, who we desire, and who we love. For many of us, that journey began alone, in the quiet of our bedrooms as teenagers, in our minds, in our hearts. Those first steps weren't the context of supportive community, but in aloneness. Our hearts knew something, though, and we found courage to follow them. Salvation can be the same sort of coming out. It means not just following what others have told us about the path, but being willing to look with the same sort of openness at who we might be and who God might be, and then taking the next step. The spiritual quest is not about following the crowd, but about following the divine, and that will take us in unexpected directions. Working out salvation is like coming out. What it meant when I started and what it means to me now are quite different. I love Tanis's imagery of connecting coming out to the journey of salvation. Liberation theologians love citing the beginning of Exodus as the pinnacle story from the Bible of freedom from oppression. The themes of that book resonate with the queer community. exodus and liberation, subversion and rebellion, wandering in the wilderness, and a communal response to revelation. We need to recall that one of the reasons why the Egyptians placed the Israelites into captivity in the first place was out of fear, that they were growing too numerous. How too often is the queer community or any other marginalized people perceived as being too numerous and hence a potential threat to society and its norms, or, heaven forbid, the children? But in no way is the Exodus account a perfect model. We must also recall that the liberation of Egypt leads to the conquering of Canaan, where a lot of people get killed. This is in addition to those that were already innocently killed in that 10th plague of the Egypt story. This sad reality is made painfully aware at every annual Passover Seder meal. A Jewish Seder is not merely a reenactment of the Exodus story as if it was some sort of pageant, but a prayerful experience that is geared to mark solidarity with all those who are suffering, past, present, and future. Each food item on a Seder plate is meant to evoke a certain emotional response that is meant to help bridge that solidarity. Harelset, for example, is an apple nut mixture that closely resembles the look of brick mortar that would have been used by the slaves to help build up Egypt. A bitter herb such as horseradish symbolizes the harshness and bitterness of slavery. A container of salt water allows one to get that taste of sweat and tears associated not only with the slavery, but also the death of the innocents. And of course, there are other items as well, including lots of wine. But in the 1980s, Susanna Heschel, a well-known Jewish feminist scholar, added an orange to the Seder plate to serve as a symbol of inclusion of gays, lesbians, and others who feel marginalized within the Jewish community. Why an orange? Fruitfulness. In addition, each orange may contain a few seeds that need to be spit out, a gesture of repudiating homophobia, if you will. Puh! Despite not being a perfect model of liberation, the Exodus story does reinforce that if you have faith in God, God will not abandon you and will lead you to freedom. When Jesus returned from the dead, he appeared in front of a select few of his disciples. When a person first comes out publicly as queer, they usually also do so to their nearest and dearest, the people who love them and in whom they love and trust in return. Usually a select few. Just imagine how sacred that experience would have been for those disciples to see Jesus for the first time in that new and glorified body. Coming out is not just for the individual, but for the entire queer community as well, to see that we are not alone. There's strength in numbers, and it's up to us to spread the good news of the glorified body, the glorified self. Coming out is sacred. And like baptisms in the early church, doing so publicly can be scary and dangerous. But at the same time, it's exciting because you finally get to be born again into your true self. And for a transgender person, this could even mean getting a new name. If someone comes out to you, treat it as a precious gift because it is a vulnerable act. And like the disciples who encountered Christ on the road to Emmaus, it means that you also are very special to that person.